One of these days where technical problems prevail and I have to retake the video several times, but hopefully it'll work now. So I got this book recently, Blood Red Roses, The Archaeology of a Mass Grave from the Battle of Towton, 1461. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. Sometimes British place names have very strange arbitrary pronunciation that doesn't match the spelling. Anyway, this occurred during the Wars of the Roses in Britain, caused by the conflict between House York and House Lannister. House Lancaster, of course. I was just pulling your leg. And this is often called Britain's bloodiest battle. The casualties were numbered by the heralds at the time at 28,000. I haven't read the entire book cover to cover yet, but there's lots of material for future videos, and I've read several chapters. I want to focus here specifically on Chapter 8, Battle-Related Trauma, an article by Shannon A. Novak. And this examined 39 burials, so that's a rather small sample, considering the total number of casualties. So we can only draw tentative conclusions for this, so it's not entirely representative necessarily, but it still gives you a good idea of the injuries, definitely. It's interesting to see the large number of head wounds here. 28 crania were examined, and out of those, 27 have perimortem trauma. Perimortem means at or near the time of death, so these are injuries where we can be certain that they were inflicted as a result of the fighting. It's also interesting to see that the majority of injuries below the head were to the arms and hands, which is 22 injuries caused with a sharp blade. That is 60% out of the total injuries below the head. And we've got 4 injuries with blunt force, which is 66% out of all blunt force below the head. And then the next largest group is the neck. 7 injuries with sharp weapon, which is 19%, 1 with a blunt weapon, which is 17%. Very few injuries to the chest. It's only 1 with sharp force, which is a mere 3%, and none with a blunt force. And the reason for that is most likely the armor. The torso usually receives the best armor. It is also easiest to protect with armor. And they had pretty substantial protection at the time. The armor worn during that battle would be a topic for a separate video, but just to give you an example, brigandines would have been used. So those are arming jackets with overlapping iron plates riveted to the inside. Mail shirts were also still in use, and also padded jacks, gambesons, and of course steel breastplate, mostly used by the nobility, of course. So let's return to the head injuries. It's interesting to compare the number of wounds caused by sharp versus blunt weapons. The majority is actually caused by sharp weapons. 73 wounds on the crania are caused by sharp weapons, so that's 65%, out of which 51 penetrated, that's 70%. And so that also shows you that quite a lot of skulls had more than one injury. And then we've got 28 wounds caused by blunt weapons, which is 25%, and 18 of those penetrated, that's 64%, so pretty similar in both cases. So you can say that between 2/3 and 3/4 of those hits were substantial. They penetrated far enough to cause quite significant injuries. And then we've got 12 puncture wounds, that's 10%, and out of those 100% penetrated. So not really surprising, while a cut with a sharp weapon can cause the most grievous wounds, I would say, the most horrifying wounds, it's generally easier to cause substantial damage with a thrust. I'm also going to show you scans of a few of the pictures, so you get an idea of the location of a lot of the injuries. So the majority of the injuries were inflicted either from the front or from the back, which makes sense considering fighting in formation. You can't necessarily swing that well from the side, because then you also have to worry about someone next to you. And you may also be surprised by the number of head injuries despite helmets being worn. During that time, the salad was quite popular in Britain, but some soldiers only had padded caps, and not everybody could afford a helmet. And of course, if it's an open face helmet, you don't get any protection against thrusts or cuts directly from the front to the face. And some of those wounds on the back of the head could also have been caused while on flight, especially if the soldier actually discarded the helmet in an attempt to run faster, then you would definitely see injuries like that to the back of the head. And the helmets might also have simply fallen off in some cases. On depictions like this, you don't actually see any chin straps. I don't know if that's artistic license, if most helmets actually had chin straps. I would normally expect that because, you know, just putting the helmet on the head and just relying that it stays in place, that doesn't seem like the greatest way to do it. The idea that some of the injuries could have been caused through the helmet, yeah, I could imagine that, especially a warhammer might simply inflict so much blunt trauma that the helmet simply can't protect you entirely. But looking at the injuries, most of them do look like they were hitting an unarmored head. So this might have been people who simply didn't have helmets, or maybe they fell off, like I mentioned. But then again, you have quite a few cuts on the head as well, and I simply cannot imagine that a sword could easily cut through a helmet. I mean, maybe if it's an iron helmet and a hardened steel sword, you do have some historical depictions that show just that. Apparently, a sword or a falchion hacking straight through the helmet and into the person's head. I have some difficulty believing that. I mean, maybe it happened, maybe it didn't, maybe it was just medieval Hollywood, basically. You know, just action shots. Oh, look at all the power in this cut, the righteous might. So yes, overall, a lot of injuries to the head, most of them caused by sharp weapons, and second most common, apparently, hits to the limbs. And that makes a lot of sense, considering the battlefield especially. You really need to make sure that you disable the threat, you take them out. And this also tells us something interesting about blunt versus sharp weapons. Generally, you can make the argument that a sharp weapon is more lethal, because there are some hits which can be lethal with a blade, with a sharp blade, as opposed to a blunt weapon like a warhammer or mace. For example, the inside of the thigh, if you get a cut there, that can be very lethal. If the major blood vessels are severed there, you would bleed out pretty quickly, whereas a blunt weapon in the same spot wouldn't necessarily kill. It may still be incapacitating. It may still prevent the use of the leg because of broken bones or injuries to the tendons or ligaments or muscles. But you can generally argue that, well, sharp blade is potentially more lethal. But at the same time, if you have to take them out as quickly as possible, you kind of have to go for the head. Because even if you were to run an opponent through with your sword, which, considering the excellent torso protection, is not necessarily an option, but even if you manage that, it may still take them a while to drop, so they can still threaten you. Or even if you deliver a cut to the leg and the guy goes down, he may still be able to, thrust upwards from the ground, and that would still be a threat both to you and other soldiers on your side. So really the only way to make sure that they can't threaten you anymore is take out the central processing unit, so to speak. So yeah, cracking that skull. It doesn't even matter whether you really kill them or just knock them unconscious. And also during sword practice, I find when I use a shield, my head becomes the prime target, because the shield is really good at covering the body and also the arms to a large extent. I mean, obviously one arm is behind the shield, the other can also be behind the shield if you make sure that you don't extend it too far. Although if you have a two-handed pole arm, then your arms become very vulnerable. I got a lot of hits on the arms when I was using the pole hammer, and that is also reflected in the fines. So I would assume that a lot of these injuries to the arms probably happen to two-handed weapon users, being longsword or pole arm. There's of course a lot more to talk about, and I can always make separate videos about some more of these topics. Hope you found this interesting, and thanks for watching.